This is a topic I've spoken about before on this channel, and other channels, with Sargon, with Adam and Sitch, but the idea is kicking off again on social media, and I think I'm now a bit more equipped to do it justice, so let's give it a go. This all started with the recent glut of articles proclaiming the end of the all-male, all-white cockpit. Some airplane crews are now all women, or all black women. And this is cause for celebration. More non-white, non-males are being included in the airline industry. Right now, trolls are reposting these triumphant articles, alongside a couple of stories coming out recently where planes are malfunctioning mid-flight, which is a pretty good joke, I gotta admit. But the general normie reply to the celebration of the end of the all-white, all-male cockpit is best exemplified by Andrew Wilco's simple take. Can't we just hire the best person for the job? And I personally agree. That was the point of the whole content of their character and not the color of their skin thing. But today's racial activists have largely forgotten that liberalism means colorblindness, not racial privilege. Aaron McIntyre replied with, "No, civil rights law has made that illegal. Diversity, equity, inclusion isn't some crazy form of communism, though its proponents are often neo-Marxists. DEI is the natural evolution of civil rights law. That is why it was able to take hold so easily. And until you are willing to unwind that Leviathan, this is the world you'll live in." Tim Pool chimed in with a simple yep, and James Lindsay replied with a simple nope, agreeing with a commenter that Tim Pool is big wrong, and DEI is 100% communism, not liberalism. Sargon then jumped in, saying communism isn't separate from liberalism. James Lindsay replied with, "Your opinion sucks, lol." Sargon simply said, "It seems to be correct though." Lindsay remarked, "To who, simpletons?" Sargon said, "To the people who understand the genealogy and purpose of these philosophies." Lindsay simply said, "LOL, okay." With Sargon agreeing, it's a hard pill to swallow. Lindsay then retorted with, "It's just wrong," rejecting the offer to talk to Sargon about the topic, or any other topic, saying he doesn't respect him. Sargon's final reply before James Lindsay blocked him was, "That's a shame, James, because between us, I'm the one who actually understands liberalism and why it's brought us to the position that we're in. You are far too emotionally committed to see the woods for the trees, and are being incredibly rude to defend your lack of knowledge." Yeah, James was kinda rude in this exchange, not gonna lie. He is pretty knowledgeable on some things, though. I know he has no idea who I am, but I bet if he watched my video on Antonio Gramsci, he would probably agree with it. He's said similar things on the topic himself, tracing the genealogy of modern-day diversity movements back through the civil rights movement, which was mentored in critical theory by the Frankfurt School, who brought the philosophy to America from the leftist intellectual scene in Europe, where it was first conceptualized as Western Marxism in order to distinguish it from Eastern Soviet Marxism, all stemming from the Italian socialist Antonio Gramsci, who was active in the socialist movement from the 1910s until he was imprisoned by Mussolini. I go into detail on all these events in my Gramsci video. And it's also stuff that Lindsay's spoken about publicly as well. He knows that there's a traceable lineage from Gramsci's ideas to modern-day racial activism, and therefore liberalism, being a different philosophy than socialism and quite opposed to it, should also reject modern-day racial activism for being anti-liberal and socialist in disguise. However, Sargon is making the claim that there is a similar traceable lineage from liberalism to socialism, and that despite the liberal world's great successes, the philosophy of liberalism contains within it key flaws that have been carried forward through that lineage into socialism, where they are now causing problems for us today. And although James Lindsay never properly engages with the idea in the tweet thread, simply brushing Sargon off instead, if you examine the writings of liberals, just as you'd examine the writings of Antonio Gramsci or the Frankfurt School or the civil rights activists, you'd realize that Sargon's actually got a point. And no, it's not because he's my friend. Let me explain how. Helen Pluckrose, the co-author of James Lindsay's book, Cynical Theories, which is about postmodernism and ideological bias in academia, also jumped into the conversation. James Lindsay and I disagree on many things, but Carl's thoughts on liberalism being uninformed and not worth respecting are not among them. I can't do anything with liberalism is communism, just like I can't do anything with fish or birds. A definitional error is the only explanation. She later expanded, if Sargon means that both liberalism and communism are the products of humans, then this is just trivially true. I must assume it means more. I'm going on what it says here, and then she links Sargon's article, The 5 False Assumptions of Liberalism. There's no error here on Sargon's part, though. It's an understanding of liberal philosophy and its shortcomings, hence the title of the article. When people say liberal today, if they're not Americans who just mean the left, they're referring to the philosophy of liberalism and the political institutions that have been based on it, which I would say is pretty accurately defined on Wikipedia. Liberalism is a political and moral philosophy based on the rights of the individual. Liberty, consent of the governed, political equality, right to private property, and equality before the law. Liberals espouse various views depending on their understanding of these principles, but generally support private property, market economies, individual rights, including civil rights and human rights, liberal democracy, secularism, rule of law, economic and political freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, constitutional government, and privacy rights. As a liberal myself, that sounds pretty accurate to what I believe. But most liberals in the modern day don't ask themselves why they believe it. The answer is because they were raised in it, and liberalism is so successful that it's simply become the norm. It's the dominant ideology of the modern era, and as such, it doesn't really need to justify its existence anymore. It simply is. What Sargon is asking of James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose is to justify liberalism's existence, beyond the obvious answer of it won, which to be fair, it did. But what is the underpinning? What does it rest on? That is where their conversation broke down. So, let's examine what liberalism rests on. Thomas Hobbes' most famous quote from Leviathan is often misattributed to him describing life in a democracy as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But that's not the real context of the quote. Here's the whole thing so you can understand it. As long as men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in the condition known as war, and it is a war of every man against every man. What constitutes war is not actual fighting, but a known disposition to fight during a time when there is no assurance to the contrary. All other time is peace. Therefore, whatever results from a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, also results from a time when men live with no other security but what their own strength and ingenuity provides them with. In such conditions, there is no place for hard work, because there is no assurance it will yield results, and consequently no cultivation of the earth, no navigation or use of materials that can be imported by sea, no construction of large buildings, no machines for moving things that require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no practical skills, no literature or scholarship, no society, and worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. What Hobbes is saying here is that in the absence of an overarching authority, whether that be a strong king from his time or a modern government, humans living in a state of anarchy is the same as humans living in a state of perpetual warfare, where nobody builds anything or invests for the future because there's no guarantee it won't simply be taken from you by somebody else. But if there's an authority that all the people submit to, then there is at least a standard of law and an understanding of kinship as fellow subjects of the authority, and this provides the stability necessary for society to flourish. John Locke, considered to be the first liberal, wrote that in a state of nature, a time in human prehistory before the first governments appeared, some humans would indeed live as Hobbes described, brutes locked in eternal warfare without an authority to unite them. But Locke insisted that other humans would live by what he dubbed the law of reason, where rational people would voluntarily choose to not harm each other or their possessions, knowing it would bring retaliation. For Locke, a society completely comprised of rational humans didn't need the overarching authority of a government, as reason would provide the social balance. But the brutes still exist, acting irrationally and disrupting the balance, and so reasonable people enter into a voluntary contract with each other to form a government to protect against the brutes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, considered to be the other first liberal, pushed this idea of the state of nature to its extreme. It was his belief that humans simply acted as solitary animals, wandering, eating, hunting, and sleeping as they liked. Because nature provided for all of his wants, he would have no reason to fight other humans, and he would generally be disinterested in other people should they cross paths. Men and women would occasionally meet up to reproduce, after which the man would go off on his own way, and the woman would care for the children until they were old enough to go off on their own. Living separately, humans would not know envy or distrust for each other, and neither property nor conflict would exist. Rousseau believed that prehistoric humans existed as isolated individuals with little differences between them, just as a lot of animals do. What he describes is, in fact, how bears in Canada and the northern United States actually live, as isolated individuals, keeping to themselves, spending their days hunting and foraging, only coming together to mate. Mother bears, though they're famous for how protective they are of their offspring, are also known to attack their own offspring to run them off after they're old enough to go off on their own, as a way of her returning to her isolation. And you thought your parents were rough on you after graduation. When it comes to that humanity in the state of nature thought experiment, these three philosophers, Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes, exist on a spectrum of idealization, with Rousseau believing the state of nature was ideal, Hobbes believing it was terrible, and Locke taking a middle road approach. But with modern archaeology, we understand now that Rousseau and Locke's views were not true. Human prehistory never contained a period of isolated individualism, nor did it contain humans who lived by the law of reason. We now know that humans lived in tribes, which were bound together by sentiment, custom, and culture, that the justification for those tribes' existence rested in spiritual tradition, family lineages, and success in war, and that these were not people of reason and enlightenment, but of superstition and authority. In other words, Hobbes was correct. There was no pre-social human. Humans have always been social beings. Now you might ask, as Helen Pluckrose did, who cares about this, Dev? It doesn't matter if old liberal philosophers were wrong about humans in the state of nature. What does that have to do with the practical, on-the-ground liberalism of today? Well, the issue is that list of liberal values, the one that I pulled off Wikipedia, their foundation rests in this thought experiment. Again, let me show you how. A common liberal value is equality. I don't mean socialistic equality of outcomes, everyone owns things in common equality, but we will discuss that a little bit later. I mean liberal equality, which primarily concerns itself with social inequality. A liberal in medieval Europe might look at the social structure of feudalism and proclaim that inequality of rank is a social ill, that a different standard of law is applied based on one social class, and that this state of affairs is immoral. Rousseau argued that if social inequality is a consequence of society itself, social inequality would not be an issue in the state of nature. To him, social inequality was the imposition of society, and humanity's natural state was equality. For Locke, he called this state of humanity the tabula rasa, which is Latin for scraped tablet. Locke was referring to wax tablets that Romans would use for temporary writing. They would write on the wax with a stylus, and then once they no longer needed the writing, a spatula affixed to the other end of the stylus would be used to scrape the wax, flattening it down to its original form, so that it may be written on once again. Locke used the scraped tablet example as a metaphor of the human mind, that the individual is born a blank wax slate, and it is their society and experiences that write the content of their character into the wax. Locke would use this metaphor to describe what liberals call nowadays the universal man. In modern parlance, if you've ever heard somebody say that if, using the hand of God, you arbitrarily plucked somebody from society A and placed them into a family in society B, that person would grow up to be a true member of society B, despite their genetic difference, they're appealing to Locke's tabula rasa idea. In other words, the modern blank slate theory that socialists, progressive activists, and postmodern scholars lean on when they say that everything is a social construct, and we should engineer society to create the proper types of people, what they're leaning on is a classically liberal idea. Locke's tabula rasa and Rousseau's critique of social inequality are both built on the assumption that once you peel away all the layers of a human, like an onion, what's left at the center is some equal, interchangeable humanness, and that we know this is the case because it existed in the state of nature. But again, the state of nature is false. As we continue to examine those liberal values, we can see that they all have their origins in the debate between Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes, and that the liberals were generally wrong about it. Let's take another liberal value, freedom. Rousseau famously wrote that man is born free and everywhere else he is in chains. This again stems from the state of nature, where the isolated individual is free in nature to do as he likes, and it's society that chains him. But again, due to archaeology, we know that tribal structures were anything but free. For Locke, because all people were equal due to the blank slate, any differences between people were products of society. Freedom was therefore required because social constructions, like for example class differences, were not a justification for one person to infringe upon another. This comes together in what liberals tend to call the social contract, where the roaming savage voluntarily exits the state of nature and submits himself to a higher authority in exchange for that authority's protection and the safety of society. Of course, if you were to ask a social contract liberal, what happens if I don't consent to the contract? What happens if I want to alter it? How can I withdraw from it? They will generally say that your participation in society and you enjoying its fruits is your consent to the contract, and that if you truly want to withdraw from it, you must withdraw from civilization and return to being Locke's roaming savage, Rousseau's isolated individual, because civilization and all of its fruits are products of the social contract. Of course, libertarians are often the first ones to agree to that bargain, smugly pointing out that almost all land on Earth is now under somebody's jurisdiction, and so there is no place to withdraw to, and that even if large swaths of people reject the social contract, which has happened before, the state and its enforcement arm nonetheless continue to exist. And what about rights? There are many rights that liberals enjoy, and they have been very good for their societies and the people living in them. But what's their source? In Locke's view, the law of reason we spoke about earlier was a component of natural law. Natural law is a system of law based on a close observation of human nature, and based on values intrinsic to human nature that can be deduced and applied independently of positive law, that is, the enacted laws of a state or a society. According to this view, all people have inherent rights, conferred not by an act of legislation of a government, but by God, nature, or reason. At least this is what Wikipedia says again. And again, it's pretty accurate. To put it in modern terms, we can observe human psychology and see how humans ideally behave, and then our actual governments should construct their on-paper laws to adhere as closely to that behavior as possible. This is why, for the modern liberal, they often say law should be downstream from culture, and that the state should only intervene to protect people's rights, not to itself infringe upon them with its own moral standard separate from the people's. The fascists derisively called this state of affairs the night watchman state, which is a term that liberals eventually took for themselves as a self-descriptor of their ideal government. For Locke, humans had natural rights, which were derived from natural law, but also that humans voluntarily gave up those rights in exchange for civil rights upon leaving the state of nature and joining civilization. In his second treatise, he wrote, "Men, when they enter into society, give up the equality, liberty, and executive power they had in the state of nature, into the hands of the society, to be so far disposed of by the legislative, as the good of society shall require." Rousseau believed much the same thing. The total alienation of each associate, together with all of his rights to the whole community. When the prince says to him, "It is expedient for the state that you should die," he ought to die, because it is only on that condition that he has been living in security up to the present, and because his life is no longer a mere bounty of nature, but a gift made conditionally by the state. Here's a quick recap before we go any further. I'm personally a liberal. I like the civilization liberalism has built. But the concept of human rights, which we simply accept as true and good without any critical thought, because 1, that's the society we were born into, and 2, our society's incredible success, this idea has gone unexamined by most modern liberals. And once we examine the concept of human rights, we must understand it sits atop a very shaky philosophical foundation. Why do we have human rights? There's 2 answers to that question. The first one is because having them produces good results, that it's better to have them than not, and therefore we should. That is true, but let's set that answer aside for a moment. We'll return to it later. The second answer is because modern human rights and the older civil rights that they superseded, they were both derived from natural rights, that we observed human nature, discovered natural law, and strived to create societies in harmony with that law as best we can. And what is that natural law that we have derived those modern human rights from? The blank slate of Locke and the isolated individual of Rousseau. The moral underpinnings of all of this really does all stem from man in the state of nature. Let's bring it back around to the discussion between Sargon and James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose. Sargon expanded on that initial statement that got Lindsay so angry. Communism isn't separate from liberalism. It frames itself as a critique and postulates a solution. It is clearly an ideological descendant of liberalism. Now, personally, I think the statement, "communism is an ideological descendant of liberalism," is significantly more accurate than "communism isn't separate from liberalism." Communism is separate from liberalism in the same way that you are separate from your great-grandfather. But I get the point that he's making. And you know what? So do the communists. In 2014, the socialist rag Jacobin published Liberalism's Crisis, Socialism's Promise, with the tagline of "Socialism isn't the negation of liberalism, it's the realization of liberal values made impossible by capitalism." This sentiment is echoed everywhere, and you can see it with a quick search online of the phrase "promises of liberalism." Here's what's meant by this. The 3 core philosophical values of liberalism, from which everything else stems, are liberty, equality, and fraternity. They're so iconic, they're actually the motto of many liberal countries, most notably the French Republic. The socialist point of view is that liberalism has failed to uphold these 3 promises, and that socialism is not the enemy of liberalism, but simply its next phase. Here's how a socialist would view this conversation. Liberty? The liberal might promise you political liberty, bourgeois liberty, but it's of limited use if you're still subject to the whims of a dictator in the workplace. The socialist, therefore, offers more liberty, not just political liberty, but economic liberty, by democratizing not only the government, but private enterprise. Equality? What equality can liberalism offer you if the class divide still exists? The bourgeois still receive preferential treatment not only from civil society, but even in application of the law. The socialist offers true equality through the abolishment of the bourgeois. Fraternity? What fraternity is there when people are divided by class? Solidarity is the true fraternity. The total collectivization of all property and wealth will mean that the fraternity of all of humanity will thrive. This is how many socialists view socialism's relationship with liberalism, including Karl Marx, who famously critiqued the liberal conception of human rights in his essay on the Jewish question, declaring that they didn't go far enough, that the liberal was too concerned with property rights for any of his other values to ever be fulfilled. For Marx, communism was the ultimate fulfillment of the liberal values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. A stateless, moneyless, classless society would theoretically have maximum liberty. Nobody would ever be coerced to work ever again. Maximum equality. No social classes would ever again exist. Maximum fraternity. All of humanity living in collective kinship. Sometimes you get random retards like Oliver here, who will say something like, communists have always viewed liberalism as their enemy. They are diametrically opposed ideologies. The Cold War ended with liberalism winning over communism. This guy really needs to stay in his lane. It's true that the Cold War was all about one power bloc building a liberal world order, triumphing over a second power bloc building a socialist world order, which would theoretically become communism after its completion. But this isn't a discussion of real politics. Philosophically, the communists do oppose liberalism, but not because they view liberalism as an enemy. They simply view liberalism as outdated, needing replacement. Now, the same is not true the other way around. Liberals absolutely view communists as the enemy. But think of it like this. If computer programs could talk, for example, and one version of an application was going to be replaced by version 2, would version 1 view version 2 as an enemy? Of course it would. Would version 2 view version 1 as an enemy? Not at all. They'd simply see their replacement as the natural course of progress. That is how a socialist views liberalism. Helen Pluckrose actually responded to all of this, stating that she wasn't familiar with liberal philosophers. And then she proceeded to make Sargon's own arguments about the flaws of liberalism back to him. I am frankly not surprised that she deactivated her account for a couple of days after that. I don't know if you're watching this video, Helen, I hope you are. The issue isn't that millions, followers of John Stuart Mill, are not real liberals. The issue is that classical liberal principles, from which our modern liberal values are descended from, have an inherent weakness within them, and I say that as a fellow liberal. Here's a picture I've used several times in this channel. It's got a man strapped into a pleasure pod, watching porn through a VR headset, having a machine suck him off constantly, with heroin being injected into his veins. We all look at this scene and feel like something's wrong here. But what's the liberals' objection to it? The person in this picture isn't lacking for liberty, equality, or fraternity, or to use a more modern framework, his consent isn't being violated, he has equality before the law, the right to private property, he has freedoms at the wazoo, quite literally, and yet it still seems wrong, doesn't it? How can we object to what's going on in this picture from within liberalism? It seems like we can't, and yet the picture still feels wrong. As for James Lindsay, he seems to be motivated by an emotional desire to completely sever socialism from liberalism, to declare that there is no genealogy that can be traced between them. But there is. Marx wrote in response to Locke and Rousseau, to Hegel and Smith, and to many others. Gramsci wrote in response to Marx, and his ideas formed Western Marxism, from the Frankfurt School to the Civil Rights Movement to modern diversity initiatives. Alternatively, George Sorel also wrote in response to Marx, and Mussolini wrote in response to Sorel. Liberalism isn't isolated from other political philosophies, because that's just not how this works. And though liberals tend to hate socialists, even if they are sometimes suckered in by them, socialists view themselves as inheritors of the liberal project. In fact, there's a fair bit of evidence that political theorists don't develop new political theories that are then afterward implemented, but rather they attempt to codify what's already happening around them. From John Locke and the Enlightenment, to Marx and the French Revolution, to Mussolini and what Mussolini was literally doing himself. This is the reason, by the way, that the true reactionaries, not the people that leftoids cry about on Twitter, but people who actually believe in the philosophy of reaction, they consider liberalism, socialism, and fascism to all be different strains of modernism, all the progeny of the Enlightenment, and that our society can only be saved by rejecting them all and returning to monarchy. It is that rejection of the entire Enlightenment by the reactionaries that Sargon is kind of talking about in his articles on the false assumptions of liberalism. All of our modern political philosophy rests on top of those false assumptions. Liberalism's radical deformations into socialism and fascism over long stretches of time, as these ideas have been passed down through different movements and writers, they do in fact stem back from those false assumptions, as the writings of Locke and Rousseau formed the foundation for what we now know as human rights, which is prime for socialist subversion due to the false assumptions. The socialist, by the way, has his own language for these false assumptions. He calls them the contradictions of capitalism. But even though he claims to resolve those contradictions, he never does, he only exacerbates them. But that's a topic for another time. So, what's the solution to all this? Is it to reject the entire Enlightenment and return to tradition, as the reactionaries want? I personally don't think so. I actually like the modern world, with all of its flaws. I think the answer is found in that question I asked a long time ago: why do we have human rights? The second answer was because they are descended from and justified by the man in the state of nature thought experiment that Locke and Rousseau engaged in. That answer ended up being pretty flawed. But the first answer, which we put aside, we'll now return to. That answer was because having them produces good results, that it's better to have them than not have them. That's true, but it's very arbitrary, isn't it? It's not really convincing, at least on paper. When you see the fruits of it in the real world, when you go outside and see the practical reality you live in, assuming that you're a Westerner listening to this, then the question of why should we have human rights seems absurd on the face of it. Look at what we have. Look at what it's given us. The phrase, "because it works," is the ultimate arbitrary answer. It adheres to no political philosophy. It defies the predicted outcomes of many failed political theories, socialism and fascism and libertarianism and 100 others, though for all of them, it's often worded as "because it doesn't work." It makes people who like theories and explanations, who need intellectual answers to the problems, feel very unsatisfied. And yet, it's rock solid. The fact that liberal societies just function better than the alternatives by any real-world metric is evidence enough that the liberals of old, despite their faulty assumptions, still managed to unearth some deep truths about how things should be run. Or alternatively, they documented what they saw around them as working and not working, and then discussed them accordingly, since like I said, theories don't create themselves in a vacuum. And this is why Sargon is no longer a liberal but a conservative, and why the type of liberal that I am is strongly influenced by conservatism, a liberal conservative. Because in the absence of a correct philosophical foundation upon which liberal values can rest, we only have two options. One is that liberalism continues to try and square that circle, implement those promises, leaving it open to subversion by socialists who speak the same promises but simply promise more of them. Two is that liberalism adopts a different foundation, and there is one out there that conservatives are already quite comfortable with, and that some liberals have already begun to use: the foundation of traditionalism. There's a reason that some liberal thinkers describe it as the liberal tradition, after all. Didn't you guys ever wonder about that? Conservative writer Edmund Burke famously wrote that instead of casting away all of our old prejudices, we cherish them to a very considerable degree, and to take more shame on ourselves, we cherish them because they are prejudices. And the longer they've lasted, and the more generally they've prevailed, the more we cherish them. We are afraid to put men to live and trade each on his own private stock of reason, because we suspect that the stock in each man is small, and that individuals would do better to avail themselves of the general bank and capital of nations and of ages. Many of our men of speculation, instead of exploding general prejudices, employ their sagacity to discover the latent wisdom which prevails in them. If they find what they seek, and they seldom fail, they think it more wise to continue the prejudice, with the reason involved, than to cast away the coat of prejudice and to leave nothing but the naked reason. Because prejudice, with its reason, has a motive to give action to that reason, and an affection which will give it permanence. What Burke is saying here is basically that tradition is the inherited wisdom of all the millions of humans who came before you, each of them more or less as smart as you are, and that they all figured out a bunch of shit that worked well enough to be passed on. Your traditions have survived the crucible of time, so you should at least consider them before deciding to toss them to the wind simply because they're old and you think you know better. G.K. Chesterton came up with a similar idea in a more modern form, the thought experiment of Chesterton's fence. He wrote, "There exists in such a case a certain institution or law, let us say for the sake of simplicity, a fence or a gate erected across a road. The more modern type of reformer goes gaily up to it and says, 'I don't see the use of this, let's clear it away.' To which the more intelligent type of reformer will do well to answer, 'If you don't see the use of it, I certainly won't let you clear it away. Go away and think. Then, when you can come back and tell me that you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy it.' The point here is that you shouldn't change things until you understand why they are as they are, because sometimes things are as they are for a good reason that you, in all of your stupidity and arrogance and bias, can't actually see, and therefore you incorrectly assume it has no purpose." Chesterton and Burke were both conservatives, but not reactionaries as far as I can tell. They weren't against the Enlightenment project. They advocated for restraint in the face of progress, but not stagnation. Careful thought, practicality over theory, consideration of possible alternatives and downstream effects before you make a change. Not no change, and not change for change's sake. This is the golden mean, the eye of the needle that liberalism now needs to thread. Critiques of pure reason without real-world experience are what socialism employs to undermine liberalism through its own values. But conservatism's combination of what Burke called reason and prejudice can serve to ground liberalism in practicality. In other words, we should be deferent to liberal values because they've worked for a long while now. The proof is in the pudding. Changing those liberal values shouldn't be done as a part of a moral arc of history, a march of progress, towards the next ideology, but instead as a practical consideration. If socialism wants to call itself the next stage of progress, the liberals should nonetheless examine their proposals with a keen eye. And if those proposals are lacking, they should be rejected, even if that means, quote-unquote, rejecting progress. Because the goal isn't actually progress. It's keeping things on an even keel. Yeah, I took that last bit from their conservative political philosopher, Michael Oakeshott this time. In political activity, men sail a boundless and bottomless sea. There is neither harbor for shelter nor floor for anchorage, neither starting place nor appointed destination. The enterprise is to keep afloat on an even keel. Like, guys, listen to that. Is that not the best way to describe the proper running of a government? It's not about progress for the sake of progress, and stability is a virtue that progressives just seem to reject. I generally don't like conservative politicians, especially in America, but conservative philosophers are top tier, and they provide the best philosophical bulwark for liberals against the left. And you know what? The most successful liberal project, the United States of America, the Founding Fathers knew all this stuff too. What are the first words in the American Constitution? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The Founding Fathers were certainly educated in the ideas of Locke and Rousseau. In fact, America's first great political rivalry, Jefferson versus Adams, was essentially Lockean liberalism versus Rousseauian. But nonetheless, America was not born out of the state of nature, and the Founding Fathers knew it. The words "we the people" refer not to a nation that is to be created by the Constitution, but a population of people that had already come to see itself as an interconnected group, that already had in place a civil society ready for nationhood. Remember, theory comes after political action, not before. It's the traditions the first Americans inherited that served as the foundation for American liberalism. And when conservatives point out that the problems of modern American liberalism stem from the fact that there is no longer a united culture or a fellowship or a language or a religion or a philosophy or something that keeps all Americans together as Americans, they've got a good point. Liberalism is a good philosophy, but it's an incomplete one. By design, in fact. The whole point of it is that there should be a private sphere in which the government has no say. But the downside is that if there is no unifying civil force that keeps the population together, liberal values are rapidly weaponized by people within the society that no longer see their neighbor as their neighbor. And liberal politics are slowly undermined by subversives who promise liberalism plus, but never actually deliver it. And the reason they're successful is because without conservatism, liberalism's already lost its best feedback mechanism. Conservatism is the other half of the equation here, the yin to liberalism's yang. That's why, even as I personally like a lot of liberal values and want to see many liberal policies implemented, I am a conservative liberal, or a liberal conservative, whatever. This is the stuff that James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, for all of their other work, just don't understand about this topic. They don't know the philosophy. They don't have to know it either. They can promote liberal values without the philosophy, but it has to sit on top of something else in order for it to be stable and functional and not subverted by socialists. Liberalism doesn't work without something from the outside holding it all together. Right here at the end of the video, let's refer back to that Coom Pod picture from before. How would liberalism address this? Does this man need more freedom or more equality? Does he need more rights? Will that make the situation better? Or do we need to step outside of the liberal frame to be able to properly critique what's happening here? The Coom Pod is where socialism is leading liberalism, using its own values, and liberalism has no critique against it. But conservatism, this is where the objection to the Coom Pod lies. And to rewind this all the way back to the beginning, when Andrew Wilco asks in reference to the all-female, all-black cockpit pilots, can't we just hire the best person for the job? This is a statement that must also come from outside of liberalism, at least partially. The freedom, the equality, the human rights of liberalism have no objection to the all-female, all-black cockpit pilots, because these pilots are now more equal with their peers. They're now more liberated from their social conditions. The appeal to meritocracy requires that a culture of meritocracy exists to appeal to, which is something that can be fostered by conservatism and its focus on hard work, dedication, and order, which are great counterbalances to the liberals' freedom, equality, and rights when those things go too far. The two sets of ideas need each other, guys. It's as simple as that. Conservatism without liberalism is religious fear and stagnation. Liberalism without conservatism is the Coom Pod. This video describes all that stuff that James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose just don't get about this topic. And to be honest, if I were them, I would be a little bit embarrassed that two high-profile public intellectuals had to be told this shit by an obese internet nerd named Short Fat Otaku.